All right, it's time for the weekly news update. How are you doing this week, Steve?
Doing all right. How are you? It's been a busy week for you out there in Colorado?
That's right. It's been busy, staying very busy, actually. But, the news is keeping us busy as well. And it's a big story that we got here from the Alec Baldwin saga. Some new information has come to light that kind of gives us a little more insight into what happened during that tragic incident on the Rust set. And you wrote a piece about it. So if you want to kind of tell us what we know now.
Yeah, well, so the police released a trove of new information, videos and interviews that they had done in the aftermath of that fatal shooting. And one of the videos in particular was very revealing, and that was the rehearsal shots of the scene that led to the fatal shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of Rust, and also injured the director as well with the same shot. But they released video from that scene where they were rehearsing the Alec Baldwin drawing his gun in order to practice that scene, which I did. Now, one thing to make clear here is that I talked to the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, and they told me that video does not include the actual fatal shot. It kind of looks like it does at the end because the camera moves and stuff, but they told me that's not it doesn't actually capture the fatal shooting. So that's an important thing to note, but it does give us some really significant insight into how this all played out.
Absolutely. There was a lot of stuff up in the air. He claims he never pulled the trigger initially. So I know we covered the various possibilities that can go wrong when you're using a single action gun. Maybe something struck the hammer accidentally, or there was a mechanical malfunction. But yeah, as you said, the footage of the rehearsal shows that his finger was on the trigger
right
while he was practicing on set.
And that's really the key bit. He had said that he never pulled the trigger, which, I suppose in his mind, that might be a different action than what occurred. But you can see in that video, and people can go, those listening on the podcast can go and head over to the reload.com where there's an analysis piece. It's free for everyone that includes the video that we're talking about. But you can see that when he draws his gun, his finger is clearly on the trigger of the revolver in these rehearsal shots.
Right.
And you can also see him at one point actually with his finger on the trigger, pull the hammer back and release it, which in a single action revolver, if you have that trigger depressed, and I have one here for those watching on YouTube, I have an example of a single action revolver. If you keep your finger on that trigger and you pull that hammer back and you release it, it's going to fall forward. And if there's a round in that cylinder, it's going to ignite that round.
Right.
Now this gun that I have here I've cleared personally. I've gone through and looked through the cylinder and made sure that the gun is in fact unloaded, which nobody did, of course, on that set, unfortunately. Did not do the proper checks to make sure that the gun was not loaded with live ammunition, right, which it clearly ended up being. But the issue you'll see in that video of Baldwin drawing his pistol and then with his finger on the trigger, manipulating that hammer, pulling it back and releasing it, that's going to fire a shot if there's a live round in there. And the reason that happens is because the trigger is the only thing that keeps those sears in place. If the trigger is not pulled and you cock that hammer, it's going to get caught at 3 different points on a single action revolver, including, full cock, which is where you want to fire it. There's half cock, which is where you can freely rotate the cylinder to load and unload it and check that it's clear. And then there's also a safety notch, or quarter cock, some people call it, which is engages very quickly. you can't really pull it back very far before some sort of sear engages on one of these firearms. And the difference is when you, and it doesn't take a lot of pressure, but when you're touching that trigger, it's going to disengage all those sears, and nothing is holding back that hammer. So if you pull it back and then you release it, it's going to fall forward, and it's going to, if you pull it back far enough, it's going to fire around. And it certainly seems like, I don't know about you, Jake, but that certainly seems the most likely explanation for how this happened.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We said that when we first covered the story, that of all the scenarios that could have happened, this was always the most likely thing we thought could happen. That there was just some negligence on his part, where his finger got inside the trigger guard and depressed the trigger and had a negligent discharge. For folks that aren't maybe familiar with how a single action revolver works, that was a good demonstration. Many people don't know just how easy a trigger can be pulled on a single action revolver. It's not quite like the semi-autos that most people are familiar with these days. It's a much lighter trigger. So even if he didn't intend to have his trigger in there, if he put just enough pressure, it's a pretty crisp and easy break on one of those revolvers. And you can easily have a negligent discharge if you're not careful.
And that's where there may be some disconnect in his own mind, in Alec Baldwin's mind, between pulling a trigger and just having your finger on the trigger. But in the case of a single action revolver, there's not that much difference. It doesn't take very much pressure to actually initiate that trigger. And if you're doing it you're doing it before you've even cocked the gun, you're not going to probably recognize what you're doing if you don't understand how the gun works.
Sure.
Normally, if you don't have your finger on the trigger and you pull that hammer back, you're gonna feel it and hear it cock in the different sears, and then you have to pull the trigger to release it. But if you've got that trigger pressed even just a little bit, you're not going to hear anything or recognize anything as you're pulling it back, except for the cylinder turning if you go far enough. So you can see him in the video. You can see him with his finger on the trigger, pulling that hammer back and releasing it, which would fire a gun if it would set off a round if there were one in there. Now, I guess in these rehearsal shots that we have video of, there must not have been a live round at that point, but somehow a live round ended up in there, or maybe it was a mix of dummy rounds and live rounds, and he just sort of Russian roulette situation. He didn't get that live round until later when he was doing this action. But that's the only thing that really fits with what he's described and what we're seeing on that video, which is that he talked about never pulling the trigger, but he talked about cocking that hammer and releasing it. Well, pulling that hammer back, the only way that it's going to get released, if you don't, it doesn't go very far before catching that quarter cock or that safety notch. That's it's a tiny amount before you'd have to pull the trigger in order to get it to move anywhere back forward. And so his explanation fits with what we're seeing in that video in terms of it being a result of his finger being on the trigger while he manually cocks the hammer and releases it.
Yeah. And just to be clear to everyone, everything else we've covered on this scenario still stands, even though we have this new evidence of him with his finger on the trigger. There's, of course, several things down the chain where things went wrong. The fact that live ammunition was anywhere near the set is still a problem. The fact that the weapons handler on set saw him rehearsing with his finger on the trigger, that seems like someone should have said, "Hey, buddy, keep your finger off the trigger. That's part of weapons safety." So obviously several things had to go wrong beyond just what has come to light in this video. It's just that now we have a little more insight into what happened.
Right, exactly. I mean, this was the result of multiple mistakes by multiple people. That's how a tragedy like this happens, generally speaking. And, in this case, certainly there should not have been live ammunition. It's still not clear how it got on set or into that gun. And then the three people handled that gun at least before that shot was fired. The armorer who loaded it, the producer on set who was responsible for handing it to Alec Baldwin, and then Alec Baldwin himself. None of those people apparently did a proper safety check where they opened up the cylinder of the gun and actually looked through to see if there was any ammunition in there, and then if there was, to ensure that it was actually blanks or dummy rounds. I mean, in this case, they're rehearsing a scene for B-roll. It's effectively how Alec Baldwin had described it. So there really should not have been any ammunition in there, whether it's dummy rounds or not. There's no reason to do that. But this set was clearly a set where they were rushing and cutting corners, and that led to a lot of safety violations, even beyond what happened with these guns. And then you also have the fact that somebody was standing in the line of fire while he was handling a firearm on set, which is another thing that should not have happened. You can set up a shot to where a gun is not pointed at crew. If you need to have a shot where the gun is pointed at the camera, you can still do that without getting anyone, putting anyone in danger. There's no one behind my camera, for instance, when I'm handling this gun. But none of those things were done, and it's really like it's not just Alec Baldwin's fault, right? It's not just one person's fault that this happened. We don't, there's no news on charges or anything like that yet. They're still waiting on some forensic evidence and so forth, apparently, to make final decisions on the criminal aspect of all this. But the set was fined 6 figures, the largest fine that they could receive from the state for, the production company that made this movie, for all the safety violations. And then, to me, I think bottom line, the ultimate problem was complacency.
Yep.
These things happen. These safety violations happen because people get complacent about firearms safety. You see this, I'm a certified firearms instructor, and you see this all the time with people who handle guns and never have issues. Nothing's ever gone wrong to this point. I can be a little less, it's always gone the way I thought it would. So these safety rules are redundant. Maybe I don't need to follow every single one of them every time, but you realize why they're redundant when something like this happens. And Alec Baldwin talked about it at length, how he described how he would normally do things on set, which is like you just assumed or trusted that a gun he was handed was actually safe, or, had the right load in it, and never decided to have that verified either by himself. And there's reasons why you might not want the actors themselves to always be the ones verifying whether the gun is set up properly or not. But
sure.
At the same time, you also can have the armorer come in and show everyone involved that the gun is set up properly. And that clearly didn't happen in this case, and could have been something that was done. Probably should be the standard practice in the industry, instead of just, I trust them to do it, I don't need to verify anything. So, that had worked for his whole career until it didn't work.
Right.
And that's the problem.
Yeah. I think that's the biggest takeaway from a tragic situation is that the rules of firearm safety just always apply. Even on a movie set, it's easy, as you said, folks can easily get complacent, especially if you're an actor. You don't think you're responsible maybe for a lot of the stuff that goes on before the shot. But yeah, the rules of firearm safety you're always responsible, even if you're, like you said, the actor who doesn't typically handle the firearm. It's not that hard to learn how to check a cylinder to see if something's loaded. It's not that hard to learn the rules of keeping your finger out of the trigger guard. This just applies to all of us, not just actors. So it's easy for things to go wrong if you get complacent, and when they do go wrong, obviously it can be a terrible situation. So
yeah, you have to have the proper respect for the guns that you're handling, even if they're blank firing prop guns. Those can be dangerous as well. And when you're inherently using guns in a more dangerous scenario like filmmaking, where you're pointing guns at people, or at least having a setup where that could be necessary for the film, then if you're going to do that, you have to follow an even stricter standard of of gun safety to ensure that the gun really is unloaded. It really doesn't have live ammunition on set or in the gun, and and that you have several redundancies for a situation where a live round does get loaded into the gun, like we saw here. Well, if this shot had been set up in a way that nobody was behind, none of the crew were in the line of fire of that gun, this wouldn't have resulted in somebody's death.
Right.
So that's why like the redundancies are necessary. They were relying on the fact that no one should have live ammunition on the set, or that if it ever did make it on set, that somebody along that chain of custody would check the gun and realize that it was in there. But both of those things failed, and you could have had another redundancy in not having the crew behind that camera, which was in the line of fire for this scene, but and that would have prevented this tragedy from occurring too. But they just didn't. The first two levels of safety failed, and then they didn't do the third one. That just off the top of my head as something that's another possibility, and it resulted in somebody's death that was completely unnecessary.